Hi everyone, this is the series on Dmitry Pavlovich's 1921 diary entries, and we are still in January 15th. It's actually colder out here now than it was last night when I was doing this by candlelight. Anyway, in my 1906 video today, I also showed this, but in case any of you didn't watch that, this is a Cossack hat called in Russian a papacha. I don't think that's actually a Russian word, but probably it's a borrowed word, but that's what they were called. And yesterday we were talking about the big generals in the Civil War, the Russian Civil War that followed close on the heels of the revolution. So we talked about Denikin, Kolchak, and Wrangel. And I showed the photo of a book that I have that's absolutely fantastic on the officers in the Russian Civil War. And since we talked about Wrangel, I'm going to try and do this without knocking my laptop off the table, who was called the Black Baron, and he was someone whom Dmitry was in direct touch with and also corresponded with, although if we were to go back further in the diaries, you would hear a lot, and probably also going forward, you would hear Dmitry express a lot of frustration with Wrangel. So this is the Black Baron. He was 13 years older than Dmitry, and they had some things in common, because Wrangel, despite his Cossack uniform, started out at the same school that Dmitry would later go to, the Nicholas Cavalry School in St. Petersburg, and he then was in the same regiment as Dmitry, the Horse Guards. But during the World War, during the First World War, he became the commander of a Cossack regiment. And so here he is. Now you can really see the Black Baron in all his finery, and he would end his days in Brussels. All right, so tomorrow we can look quickly at some photos of the next of the generals, the one who was the commander of the volunteer army and was actually succeeded by Wrangel, and that man was a man that Dmitry didn't know. His name was Denikin, Anton Denikin. So tomorrow we'll see some photos of him. And today's pages from the long 1915 diary entries are starting to get a little more personal, as Dmitry will soon segue into more of a description of his life in Paris. So today we have pages 8 and 9 and just a little bit of page 10, and I decided to stop there because most of page 10, Dmitry will be talking about his position as a possible future Russian Tsar. So I don't know if he would then have the title emperor, but yeah, the Gasudar, the sovereign. All right, so let's start. Sitting in Paris is burdensome to me. I feel drawn back to England, to the days I spent in the countryside. I feel drawn to London because living there, I really felt like I was in England. I met with people a lot. I did a lot of sports, and meeting frequently with the British, I felt like I was sharing that English life a little. Living here in Paris, I don't notice Paris. I remember how before the war, there was a whole heap of concepts wrapped up in that name alone. Paris was a synonym for something festive and good. Now it's completely different. I almost never meet French people. I don't know their life. And yes, I don't particularly want to know it. There can be no talk of the old Paris, a place of fun and even ecstasy. It simply doesn't exist for me anymore. And that's why I say living in London, I was really really in England. But living in Paris, I might succeed in being comfortable, but I'm not in France. And then life itself is such a bother. And incidentally, I don't do anything. Naturally, I see a lot of Russians. The relationship with those who spend time with me is completely solid, and I try to talk with them about Russia, listening to them and, in fact, almost openly playing the role of the future monarch. So I'll stop there. I hesitated as to whether to stop there instead of just going along with the flow into him talking about his role as a possible future monarch. But we already have a lot to talk about, and I already tend to go too long. So this is a very interesting contrast. Now, when he first arrived in England in December 1918, very end of that year, he wasn't feeling so comfortable. But something that really helped and something that really made him quickly feel comfortable is the fact that he was with the Marlings, his latest set of surrogate parents, and he'd lived with them, and he'd lived in a very British environment when he was in Tehran as a refugee, and they took him in, and he actually lived at the British legation, and his commander, his pre-revolutionary commander, Baratov, who was still in Persia himself, but on the front, he'd asked Dmitri to leave the regiment because the soldiers, Dmitri's presence was agitating the soldiers. So Dmitri didn't abandon his military unit. He was asked and really told that he needed to leave. But Baratov took issue with him living at the British legation. There was a Russian legation, and there was the Russian Cossack division. They hadn't exactly, the Russian minister there, who was a Swedish Finn called Etter, had not embraced Dmitri. So he felt more comfortable at the British legation. And when Baratov wrote him and appealed to him that you can't be living at the British legation, you're a Russian officer, he responded by writing in his diaries that he absolutely knew that that was right and that was correct and that was true, but he just couldn't bring himself to leave the British legation. And I don't think it was sort of, the comfort so much that was offered him there, although he admits that he likes that, so much as it was that the Marlings were really supportive of him, really giving him, at least Sir Charles, giving him the emotional support that he needed. Lady Lucia started out giving him that, but then things got complicated by the two of them. But anyway, I wouldn't begrudge him that, because that was an important time for him. He was devastated by what was going on, and almost for the first time in his life, he was really and truly integrated into this family, and he needed it. But I am digressing big time, but here he is, and he began to feel really comfortable in England, even though the Foreign Office was always trying to get rid of him. He dug in his heels and said, I'm staying there, and I'm staying here unless the king himself kicks me out. And the king did not. And he was initially very freaked out about going to Paris, even though he was given a visa and he was given assurances by the British that they were no longer trying to get rid of him. There were other Russians and other Romanovs in Britain by that time. It still freaked him out. He was still thinking when he went to Paris that something was going to happen. He wasn't going to be allowed to go back to England. So his time in England had turned out to be a time when he felt secure and he felt appreciated. And I must say that the British upper classes and nobility went out of their way to make him feel comfortable. George and Mary, the king and queen, did not, but other members of the British royal family did. The Mountbattens did, and certainly members of the British nobility and the upper classes, they made him feel as good as he could feel under the circumstances of his life at that time. So being in Paris, you know, he went to Paris because that's where his sister settled primarily. And that's where most of the White Russian emigres, some of them, the more extreme right wing part of the emigration, settled in Germany. Some of them settled in what became Yugoslavia and in Bulgaria, and some of them settled in England, but the vast majority were in the French-speaking part of Europe. They were in France and in Belgium. And so if you were really going to be involved with emigre politics and the emigre community, you needed to be in France. But, you know, Dmitri, although he's spending time with all these Russians, it's interesting that he says that he's not spending time with French people. We've seen a few members of the French nobility mentioned in his 1921 diaries, but when he's spending time with them, he tends to comment that it's a bit on the sordid side and he's not enjoying himself. And yet he talks about what Paris was like for him before the war, and he even uses the word not just fun, but he even uses the word ecstasy. So most of the French nobility and the people like Coco Chanel that he did know in Paris, he knew from this period between 1911 and pre-war 1914, when he would go to spend time with his father. His father was in the process of moving back to Russia, slowly, but he was in the process of doing that. But Dmitri would go and visit him. He had the house in Paris, and Dmitri in 1914 turned 23, and he was, 19 and turned 20 in 1911, which is when he said he first met Coco. So he was, he was making this transition between being a teenager and being an adult, and he was just having a grand time. And he also met Americans and British socialites in Paris, and people like Cole Porter's future wife. And so in the 1920 and 1921 diaries, he's often mentioning that he got to know such and such a person in Paris before the war. And he didn't go to England before the war. He simply didn't go there. So there was sort of more emotional baggage for him in France and in Paris. And he was a Francophile and would become more of a Francophile because he would end up, before he went to Sanatorium Chatzalp, he would end up living in France. Well, he was living in hotels, but he and Audrey had bought Beaumesnil, this French chateau. And then when they divorced, he lived there until it was sold, and then he was living in hotels and dividing his time between Paris and the south of France. But he really seems to have begun to feel like, even though he was not going to take French citizenship, he was going to continue to be a stateless person, or British citizenship, or American citizenship, because he wanted to make a point of not doing that, I think. So he kept his Nansen passport, even though it was an inconvenient thing to have. But in his diaries written from Chatzalp, once the invasion of France and Belgium and Holland and the Battle of France begins in 1940, he is wholeheartedly on the side of the French. And after the French sort of give up the fight and Germany occupies parts of France, Dmitri is still very defensive about France, and he's still, his sense of allegiance to a country is more clearly with France even after that than with England. Although I think that shifted somewhat as the war continued. And the fact of the matter is, he reproached his sister for being anti-English, and he wanted his son to remain in England. But the thing was that going all the way back to the end of the First World War and England's stance on Russia after the revolution. Even though he was living with Sir Charles and Lady Lucia, he still had this love-hate relationship, and he never quite forgave the English or the British for what he perceived as their callous response to Russia's situation and Russia's and the Romanov family, and also what he perceived as not just a callous response but a sneering response, and the idea that they were happy about the revolution because they had always disapproved of the autocracy anyway, and they disapproved of Nicholas II. And so I would say Dmitri was more in his, in the 24 years he spent in exile, he was more English than French. And certainly he had learned English alongside Russian as a child, and he learned French later, and he learned German later. And in fact, people would mistake him for an Englishman. He tended to wear English-style clothing, and yeah, he was mistaken for an Englishman when he was outside of England, especially in Switzerland. And I would love to hear what he sounded like when he spoke English. I would really love to hear what kind of an accent he had, but I have been unsuccessful at finding any recordings of his voice. In fact, I actually had a dream the other day where I came across a recording of him on a record album, an old record album, and it didn't work. I heard a few words, but not enough, of his voice talking on that record album. So I wish the dream had continued. But anyway, he had equivocal feelings about England, but he was more sort of English by nature than he was French. But, he was, overall, of course, he was Russian. And we talked at length in the last episode about his being the perfect example of the Russian superfluous man. And in this diary entry in particular, he's talking about that, about how he feels about that. He's not referencing, of course, the superfluous man as the literary phenomena. He's not calling himself that, but he's saying that life has just become a drudgery, a bother. I don't do anything. And he's really depressed in this part of the diaries. He always had that tendency. And in fact, it's useful to start at the beginning with this year, because his depression is one of the things that's actually going to cause him eventually to say, to hell with it, I'm going to have this affair with Coco Chanel. Duke, sorry, my dog just grabbed my papaja, so I have to chase him down. I don't want him to chew it up. Give that back. You give that back. Okay, luckily he dropped it. He's Great Danes, you have to put things very high up if you don't want them to get them, but he's eyeing it again. Okay, so he's not making a connection with French people. Well, what he says about Paris being synonymous with sort of a holiday spirit, sort of fun and grand times, is certainly the way people continue to think about Paris. But this statement that the ecstasy, I was going into that about how much fun he had in Paris as a young man, and now it's just a letdown. He actually has quite a bit of very interesting text when he first arrives in Paris in 1918 about what effect all these years of war have had, and what it's like being in a restaurant with rationing and that sort of thing. And he also was present, ironically, for the triumphal entry of President Wilson, both in London and in Paris. And there's some great footage of that you can watch on YouTube, and great footage of what both of what post-war London and post-war France looked like, talking about post-World War One, of course. So those kind of help set the mood and set the tone if you want to watch some of those while we go through this. But anyway, so now you see this side of Dmitriev being very depressed. And there's a little bit of that we're going to be seeing in the 1906 diaries as he's moving around, and every time he has to move from one place to another, he's unhappy, and he's not particularly happy when he ends up in Ilinskaya for various reasons. But right now, we are going to segue into this theme of Dmitri as the Tsar-to-be. And so he's talking about something that he's doing from day one in Paris, meeting with these various Russian emigre officers and functionaries, mainly military men. And in this instance, he says that what he's doing is trying to talk with them about Russia, listening to them, and almost openly playing the role of the future monarch. So I guess that's an unstated thing amongst them, but that's their assumption and that's his assumption. And it's interesting that he uses the word monarch. I didn't have to translate that. That word exists in Russian as well. He doesn't use the word samodержавец or imperator or государь. Samodержавец being autocrat, he uses the word monarch. So that very strongly implies that what he means is a constitutional monarch. And if I recall correctly, he also speaks about that explicitly. When he says I try to talk with them about Russia, that's kind of an interesting way to put it, because it seems like they're coming specifically to talk to him about Russia. But maybe what he means is he's trying to talk to them about his own vision for what they should all be doing now and what's going to happen in Russia. Well, I will stop now, but I can tell you that the next episode is really going to be fascinating if you're interested in this whole subject of how Dmitri saw himself in relation to Russia and how he thinks a monarchy might be reestablished in Russia. And his mood continues to be very depressed, so don't expect anything upbeat, but that's, that's where he's at. So I will see you next time. Bye.